Welcome. I'm Michael Rasmussen, sorry, just a second here. The GRC Pundit and Analyst of GRC 2020 Research. I'm an analyst. I've got, by background, a business degree and a law degree in education, but as an analyst, I've got 25 years. I spent 7 years at Forrester Research as their top analyst and 18 years competing against Gartner, Forrester, Verdantix, Chartis as a boutique. I research what are the challenges companies like yours face in the context of governance, risk, and compliance, and how to solve those as strategy, process, and technology. I also have the GRC Report, which is a global news website on governance, risk, and compliance news around the world, and hosts the Risk is Our Business podcast and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the GRC Technology Galaxy podcast. And I'm excited to facilitate this panel, and we've got our esteemed panelists here if you want to join me on stage. I'm looking forward to that. And in that context, I've given an introduction to myself as the moderator, but what's really important are our panelists. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. John, you want to start us?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm John from Proofpoint. I am our resident Chief Compliance Officer. If you don't know Proofpoint, it's a primarily data security and data protection firm. About a fifth of the world's communications run through our servers, and I'm responsible for the compliance of that and data privacy and data protection.
It's a privilege to be here today. I'm Johanna. I have 3 decades of compliance experience across asset management, banking, and insurance. I'm currently the Chief Compliance Officer and Head of Distribution at Janus Henderson. And I really see RegTech as the bridge between innovation and oversight, and really excited to talk about this topic with you today.
Hi, my name's Amy Mahabaleswara. I'm the Head of Legal, Compliance, Strategy, and HR at Merus Global Investments, a proprietary trading firm. I grew up in my career at Goldman Sachs. I spent over 12 years there doing various compliance roles, including cross-border in Hong Kong for a while. My last role at Goldman, I ran the regulatory engagement for the prudential regulators. Really looking forward to this topic, one close to my heart.
So welcome all of you to our panel here on RegTech and the Regulators, striking the balance between innovation and risk. Around the world, we're seeing tension between innovation and oversight. Institutions need agility to adopt new technology, but regulators are under pressure to ensure stability and consistency. Today, we'll explore how RegTech can enable compliance where regulators can adapt and what the future of global harmonization might look like. We've introduced our panel, so let's get right into our theme. Our first theme that we're going to talk about is RegTech's cross-border role. So let's start with the basics. How RegTech itself is helping firms deal with cross-border complexity. What role can RegTech play in maintaining compliance consistency across borders? I just taught my policy management workshop yesterday, Policy Management by Design, and we did it at the Sanctuary Hotel next door. By the way, that's a great sushi restaurant up there, a sushi lab. Absolutely amazing omakase. But anyways, there's a lot of that discussion on how do we deal with conflicting regulations across borders and things and how they impact policies with all these regulatory changes and things. So to our audience, back to those basics. How RegTech is helping firms deal with cross-border complexity. What role can RegTech play in maintaining compliance consistency across borders? Who would like to lead us with that one?
I'm happy to start because I remember for a long time trying to keep up with new regulations with a manual spreadsheet. And I'm sure many across the room remember that as well. I think one of the key things that RegTech has changed is the scan, if you will, that's almost immediate of new global regulations, even if it's a random rule for a business we do in the middle of Thailand, and the fact that there's a scan, it pulls it up, it's in an automated way, and then feeds to people to look at it and see if it makes sense for your business and what business we conduct in that particular area. So I really like the somewhat completeness of the fact that RegTech brings to the table as opposed to the manual relying on local counsel sometimes to tell you what the rules are and things like that. So for me, that's one of the key pieces that's been life-changing.
I would say it also helps to leverage and scale. I see RegTech as the translator to take all these fragmented rules and how do you come up with global baseline standards to really help your business partners to time to market. Use a case study for marketing compliance. So marketing compliance, typically most firms now have a global marketing compliance team, or at least a centralized team. And our business partners want to use one marketing piece around the world, and as compliance officers and risk, that's complicated from a rules perspective. So with that, you may have SEC and FINRA and MSRB, and let's throw the insurance rules and regulations on there. And by the way, that firm got sued and there's litigation and whatnot. So how do you marry all of those rules together to leverage and scale to come up with those global baseline standards to apply where it makes sense against your firm's risk appetite to get content out the door quicker, faster?
And I think from the technology side, even though I am from a technology firm, I happen to have a degree in global regulation, so I see things a little differently on both sides. So definitely see how automating a lot of the rule change and the application and how that feeds into other systems is absolutely important. But if you take it down one level, down to the data itself, having different systems that have to talk to each other cross-border. So, Proofpoint has like 2 million customers globally, each having data privacy concerns, data privacy issues. Making all of those systems talk to each other, if you didn't have something automated with some intelligence, AI especially, right, some rules-based logic that was able to talk cross-border, you'd be in spreadsheet land, which is not fun, maybe for the first week.
Right, exactly. And I would also add to that where you have interpretations. And I think nothing drives our business partners more crazy than if they go to one person on the compliance team and they say, do it this way. And then another person under that same fact scenario, do it this way. Well, technically both are correct, in that regard. And where do you draw that line? So coming back to those global baseline standards and how RegTech can provide consistency in that application methodology, and then going downstream to if a regulator comes in, and how do you prove you've got your policies and procedures, and where do you draw the line from that application methodology? It really helps in that regard.
Excellent. That builds a foundation. Adding to that, I'll follow up with these questions, and I'll combine the two questions I have here. Where have you seen real success in automating cross-border requirements? And the opposite of that, where are the limitations?
I'll start with limitations.
I'll go with
it. Okay, there you go. Yeah, I think one of them is where the business is operating in a gray area. Obviously, RegTech has limitations there where it's gray. Then you really need to get counsel or someone else, a human to interpret it. I think that's one of the limitations that will take a while. But I think that the way to solve for that is to have some baseline rules that RegTech can solve for. It's not as gray as you think. There's a lot of black and white till you reach the final gray spot. And I think if you have the right decision tree built in, you can actually still automate quite a bit of it. But then when you get to the pure gray area, you go to a compliance officer, for example.
And I would add on to that, the case study that we're using, marketing compliance. So take, for instance, you're hiring a human on your team. Now that human, may know, let's say it's somebody who has 10 years compliance experience, may know the rules and regulations, but how do we do it at Janus Henderson Investor? Each firm has a little different way that they do their disclosures and where they draw the line in the sand, especially when you've got an SEC rule that's principles-based. So how do you bring those rules together to help take out some of that ambiguity? And so with that, a lot of firms, and one of the things we are doing is, let's look at our disclosures and how can we harmonize those? Looking at your rule book and your guardrails and how do you create a consistent standards where it makes sense to take one particular instance and can you apply that for EMEA, APAC, US across the board? And once you have those, then you can train the RegTech on that, just like you could train a human in that regard, and then that helps with the consistency and the repeatability.
Some of the things that I've seen, and coming from a past life in transaction monitoring and trade monitoring, definitely that space is definitely seeing the most benefit from RegTech compliance, unification of some rules, standards. Just by nature of having to do business, it's forcing a lot of companies to do the standardization. And in terms of limitations, still I believe on the data side, sharing the information on AML, KYC, sanctions, still an issue, and having systems talk to each other, internally, externally, is still a big challenge, even when I've been out of the industry about 10 years.
And I like to call that the duct tape, especially when a lot of firms are going, I'm sure everybody's here has gone through an acquisition merger, in that regard where you have systems that don't talk to each other. And how do you create that upstream, downstream continuity and methodology? How do we say things here in the US? How do we say it in EMEA, across the globe to create those global baseline standards and that consistency?
And I guess I'll kick off the positives. The piece I love, and I did spend many, many years on exams and dealing with regulators. If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And I think one of the big advantages of RegTech is you have that actual review and decision recorded somewhere. And I think obviously the data is super important, John, as you mentioned. We got to keep good data hygiene and have that somewhere. But then it's easily retrievable and to produce to a regulator. And more regulators are getting consistent on one thing, and that's that they want proof that something was reviewed. They want proof how it was reviewed. They want consistency of review, back to the problem we sometimes have with different compliance officers' responses. I think that's been a big win to start. It may not be some of the most complex issues, but I think it gets us through a lot of footfalls that you would have in initial examinations with FINRA and others, where at least you have this or the Fed, and you can show them that data pretty easily. It reduces, I think, those kind of findings.
Well,
can I add one more thing? I would also add as part of that's really also where I like taking a look at those global baseline standards, especially as you bring together various firms and the duct tape and how do we make that work and time to market, really taking a look at that and bouncing it up against your risk appetite of your firm. And then that helps with the repeatable process for the production and consistency.
Well, that sets the foundation to build the rest of our discussion on. Let's move to our second theme of balancing compliance and growth. How do they enforce rules without slowing growth? How do the regulators enforce rules without slowing growth? How can regulators enforce robust compliance measures without stifling growth and innovation? Amrita, do you want to lead us with that one?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I've seen is, and I know we'll get to this, Michael, is the collaboration, right, to even enforce the rules. And I've seen firsthand, many have been to supervisory college. It's really nice. I think regulators are really talking about that, and it's great to see them focus on it. And I think in terms of the establishment of some of the rules, regulators themselves are dealing with the use of RegTech. And so I think they're starting to have the right expertise in-house. And I've seen them not have more siloed departments, even within regulatory agencies. They're talking to each other more to understand how to put a particular rule in place, how practical is it. And it's great that they have that in-house expertise. In the past, I think regulators sometimes have to almost rely on the industry to tell them. And I think as their hiring has gotten better and more sophisticated, it's actually nice to see them start to think about that. Obviously, we always think all the rules aren't perfect. That's our job on the other side. But that piece has been nice, but maybe I'll turn it to you.
Absolutely. That's where I think partnership is key. So with the industry and the regulators coming together, and well, it's really funny, and I'll give a little story here. When, several years back, I think a lot of people thought if they just ignore AI and technology, it would go away. Mm-hmm. Here we are. And very similar, I like to go back, and I think Michael actually used this in one of the earlier panels about paper, pens. These are actually inventions, right? Yeah, innovation. Technology.
Stone tablets and chisels, that's
right.
Technology.
Exactly. You think about, so as we embrace AI and how do we leverage and scale that to the benefit of the good and then the bad actors, and how do you mitigate that? The example I like to go back to is way back when, when cars were invented, right? We didn't have seatbelts. I always say, and now I'm going to date myself, like, we didn't wear seatbelts when we were kids. We didn't have, then as cars got quicker, faster, you had seatbelts. Then you had speed limits, all of these different rules and regulations. So with that, I like to analogize it with, technology and AI and, coming out of the gates, what we knew several years ago, where we're going to be in 2 years is going to look vastly different, just like with the automobile. So.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the automobile, you go back 100 years ago, And here in New York, you look at pictures of New York City, and it's filled with horses and carriages, and there's all the infrastructure here in New York City with stables and hay and all that. And just within a few years, they're completely gone. It's completely changed. The city adapted. The industry's adapted. Technology.
I also think the job has become more fun for some of the more junior people starting, right? You're not doing as much of the grunt work. You have different kinds of grunt work, but I actually find it a better hiring tool, honestly. Like they're asking me when I'm looking to hire, what AI do you use? What RegTech do you use more generally? I think it's just made the job more fun.
Do you guys find any differences between Europe and the US on this area? Because a lot of the European regulations are principles and outcome based. They're not as prescriptive, so they give you a lot more flexibility and takes a more risk-based approach to compliance. But there might be easier to adopt certain things, but there's also more regulation in areas like AI and things in Europe as well, where so much in the US, we're slowed down by more prescriptive checklist-based compliance. Would you say that's an adequate representation?
I think the line is getting more blurred, but I'm a personal fan of outcome regulation versus regulating a very specific technology or name or product, because then you're not being innovative, I think, because you're not focused on, like, the world is evolving so much, back to both examples that you gave, that by the time the regulator's regulating that one particular piece and what it does, it's totally moved on and the business is doing something different as well. So I think it should be outcomes-based, but I don't know what others think about cross-border.
Yeah,
I think it's
this one's near and dear to me, so I totally agree with the two different types of approaches, principles-based versus prescriptive. We all know that there's pros and cons to each. A lot of folks on our side, on the U.S. side, they'd like to know what they should and shouldn't do, rather than...
And they want the get-out-jail-free card.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
They want, like, the checklist, like, okay, I'm not doing this, this, and this, whereas European, everywhere else, it's the more principles-based, you know, thou shalt not do this. We're not going to say what this is, but you just shouldn't do it. But I think overall, on both sides, having, I guess you call it risk-based regulation would be the best, phased approaches, so that you're not stifling innovation. You're still allowing people to innovate, right? So without over-regulating with certain areas. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, but I think the main thing is having proportionality in the regulations themselves. And you alluded to as well the people coming up in the regulatory space, a lot more, you know, savvy, you know, more open to new ideas, but those individuals would be definitely very impactful on how you apply these regulations, right? Bringing the industry into the decision, right? Not just making, you know, things in a lab, right? And just not having reality come into how things are actually working. And also bringing people in from industry into the regulatory process, right? Maybe they leave industry, they go onto the regulator side. I think that's a big thing that I'm seeing, right? You move from one to the other, you bring all that experience, but then you also bring the real world application of how these things would actually be working.
You brought it up. What does over-regulation look like?
Ooh, you know, stuff that just is jammed out there. You know, highly prescriptive, not phased, just rolling things out without really thinking about them, and just more not outcome-based, I guess, is the best way I can think.
And I would say over the years, too, the regulators have become more open. I don't know if you've experienced that, to industry feedback. So with that, I think there have been instances where they would come out too quick for the rule, or maybe they didn't wait for industry feedback. And then that's where that partnership, I think, is key, having a good relationship with your regulator, so you can raise your hand to say, hey, X, Y, and Z, what about this, that, the other? Like, well, that's a really good question. We didn't think about that. So then you get an FAQ, or you know, something comes out to the industry. So it's been very enlightening that they've been open to that, to really hear about where industry is struggling. We all want to do the right thing. How do we operationalize that from a compliance perspective to keep the business moving?
Right, not overreacting.
Exactly.
Right.
I think over-regulation also causes complications in the exam process, right? Because the examiners themselves also have to interpret what the over-regulation is. Very often, sometimes it's new. And so back to your point, Johanna, about dialogue, I think, you know, sometimes I'll ask the examiner, what are you looking for outcome, right? Like, what is, and he'll say, oh, I'm looking at this rule, I can't quite understand it either, but let's learn it together. And I think that's over-regulation, right? Like, the examiners also need to understand what they're looking for. They're obviously very smart and savvy, but I think there has to be a balance, if you will.
So, are there examples where regulators have got it right?
I mean, I may have people disagree, but I think GDPR was a good start, right? Coming from nothing to that. AI acts that are coming out, I think, are a good start as well. I don't think anything's perfect, but they're not stifling the...
So, Europe again.
Yeah, right.
Okay, let's move on to our next theme, standards and harmonization. All this sets the ground and raises the question, what standards could and should be universal? What fundamental compliance standards should be universally adopted, and how can regulators facilitate international harmonization?
I'll go back to my original example of supervisory college. I think really, for the GSIBs at least, working with your coverage team to create really good, obviously the Fed creates the agenda, but good agendas for them to have that conversation and then bring in firms to discuss what their current standards are and to answer questions and create dialogue. It also gives certain regulators that don't always have access, I think, to firms and management the opportunity to ask questions, in certain countries, and that leads to, my words, better goodwill and coordination among international regulators, and I think that it really leads to a great dialogue, and I see it firsthand.
I would add on, some of the examples that we discussed with that harmonization. A lot of firms are now cross-border, and with that, really with the regulators working with them on the principles-based, not so black and white, what really are we struggling with, and then how can we put those guardrails in place, or those seatbelts, as we move forward.
Also speaking a common language in terms of regulation, data, expectations. You're not going to get harmonization until you have that sync, right? That collective understanding of what we're doing, the outcomes.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting a little more granular, are there areas such as you brought up GDPR, so data protection, or AML or sanctions, or ESG/sustainability, whatever you want to call it, in the reporting there? Are any of those ripe for harmonization?
AML, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, sanctions, KYC, beneficial ownership, right? It's the Wild West. It's using a USA term there.
Yeah, and I would go back to what you were discussing, data protection, data privacy. I'd love to see harmonization there. I mean, the Europe has more of a protection of the individual, while the U.S. is much more of a fragmented approach and more protection of the business. And I'd love to see more on the individual.
Right. Asia has its own rules. I think it's such a patchwork for firms to deal with. It's really quite a challenge, which is where the RegTech is helpful, right? At least it's putting certain guardrails, but it would be much better to have the harmonization there.
Right. I would also add U.S. side when you have, so on the FINRA side, securities registrations and various things, balancing, with the privacy, with the supervision, and where do you draw that line?
Where could we see more creativity in this area of standards and harmonization over uniformity, but just more creativity from the regulators?
I think as we get new technology such as blockchain, AI, it doesn't fit into a nice, neat box. Right? It's not being, I guess, widely adopted for whatever reasons. Blockchain just makes a lot of sense for cross-border payments, but it's not being adopted. I think you're going to have to get creative as this technology becomes more pervasive. You're going to have individuals think differently, right? And I think that's where most of the creativities come from. And then also the AI that you mentioned before.
Right.
There's going to be standardization. It's going to be left up to countries, but everybody's going to have certain pieces of it. But there's not going to be one holistic answer, I believe. And I think to get that into a state where it could be applied globally, since you have global corporations, that's going to take a lot of probably the new regulators coming up from industry or coming from a different perspective, maybe the technology perspective, to make that happen.
Right. And I'll go back just because I'm a person of many examples today. 1996, that was not that long ago. Remember when we had NASD, now FINRA, and it was the first time firms were bringing out internet, believe it or not. wow, and look at where we are today. And I think that was a really good example of how do you take rule modernization from paper-based to digital, and how do we do that now today? How do we bring on AI on top of that? Another example is, way back, email. When email, I remember the day because everybody was so excited. Oh my gosh, I can send an email outside of our company, out of our walls, and at the time, from a supervisory perspective, once again, FINRA, NASD at the time based, you had to review all in and outgoing emails.
Before they left.
Yes. Can you imagine today? I mean, just with the digital, volumes, and that further, if you follow the evolution of the rules, with that, then it became risk-based, and how do we then use technology to do random sampling and whatnot? So really looking at history and how we've evolved, and then now how do we get quicker, faster in such a confined time frame with some of these examples will be very interesting over the next 2 years, I would say.
On a more practical level, I think having dialogue with firms, but without having firms fear litigation, like firms actually be able to have an open dialogue with the regulator, and not in the context of if I say something, they may come after me for this exact thing I said. I think that dialogue actually leads to innovation because eventually everyone wants an efficient market. And I think there's certain regulators that, are better at that and some that are not. And I think allowing for that, yes, there are consequences, but just allowing for that open dialogue sometimes without consequences is very, very helpful for innovation.
So, alignment versus fragmentation. The real question is whether harmonization is realistic. Are we actually moving toward alignment, or will fragmentation persist? Are we moving toward greater global regulatory alignment, or will fragmentation, I just said that. How can regulators evolve to accommodate both trends? That's a challenge. And sometimes it's like we start to get some alignment, and then we fragment, and it just weaves in and out.
I think on the policy side, I don't believe it's going to be realistic to align that globally. I think it's going to be left up to a lot of, if you're banking, in order for them to do business with other banks with certain things, that's where the harmonization and the alignment has to come from. And then maybe that'll make its way to the regulation and the policy section, because as we know, policy can change from administration or regime, and it's an ever-moving target.
I would also add that I think it depends on the compliance program also. Going back to the example of marketing compliance, where I think harmonization is very key, and you see a lot of the AI tools where you can do the metadata validation, workflow automation, and then actually have a AI 24/7 to follow the sun across the world, when marketing doesn't sleep, in that regard. So there's opportunities there, but you do get some fragmentation, but that's where I think it's key to take a look at your global baseline standards to determine where are those deviations, and then where do they make sense, and then obviously having that in your policies, your procedures, and then training your business partners so they understand, well, if I'm doing this in EMEA, because we have an office there, well, you have to use reverse solicitation versus here, So I think the knowledge is so important to help them to understand the why behind the how you do it.
And just to pull the thread on that, Johanna, I agree, because I think the business just wants to do business. They don't want to circumvent any of the rules. They're just focused on whatever the client pitches. And so I actually think the RegTech, as you alluded to, really helps, because it's like, okay, no, because of the following, they can just go tweak it and come back. I think they find it very helpful.
For some context, I'm in Europe every month. I'm in London next week, Denmark, Sweden the following, but I was sitting down with a large EU financial services company, and the topic is operational resilience. They said, we've got our DORA project here. We've got UK operational resilience project over there. They got Australia CPS 230 over there. Monetary Authority of Singapore and Hong Kong, those projects, all on operational resilience because it's so fragmented. So the question building on this is, how do institutions navigate both, aligning internally so we can have one operational resilience program, for example, just as an example, while meeting fragmented external requirements? The regulations, there's some similarities, but there's also nuances.
I think commonality, if you look at all the regulations, there are a lot more common themes within them. So if we can align on what's common and then allow some flexibility maybe at the local level, I think that's probably as close as you can get.
I would add just the use of natural language processing as well, like to really understand what a particular rule means. Sometimes the regulations in various jurisdictions are saying the same thing. They're just saying it with different nuances, which then you interpret from your home, country for the firm. I think that has changed a lot, and then you understand what the actual commonalities are, not just what's on the page.
Our final theme, and I don't see any audience questions yet, but feel free to submit your audience questions in the app. But in this final theme, partnerships in sandboxes. To close, let's highlight practical examples, partnerships in sandboxes that are shaping the future. What partnerships, frameworks, or regulatory sandboxes are emerging that you see as most impactful for the future?
I'd go back to the AI sandboxes that are out there, especially UK has pretty innovative sandboxes. MAS, of course. Blockchain, I'm a big fan of blockchain. So those sandboxes, I know it's not just one, but there are many blockchain sandboxes I think that would provide tons of benefits if we allow them to grow further.
Yeah, I continue to be very impressed with the UK sandboxes and how they're working through that.
They're sort of leading in that area.
100%.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts or recommendations for our audience? How about from each of you? Give it a couple seconds to think. Give us 30 seconds to 1 minute. Final thoughts and recommendations and summary.
I'll go first. So with that, I would say be open to change. Think outside of the box. Some of the examples I gave, who would have thought we would be in cars that can go over 100 miles an hour? Yeah. With seatbelts this time, and speed limits, although not everybody follows the speed limit. So how do you mitigate that? So with that, being open to change, I would say, and this always gives me a chuckle, compliance, because I hear compliance isn't creative, but I think that's what I do all day long. Really thinking outside of the box, embracing ideas, to be open to challenges as well. That's where I think the partnership with not only the regulators, but also your business, to understand what are they dealing with day in and day out, and how can we make it easier from an interpretation, or whether it's baseline standards in cases where it makes sense. So really embracing that change, I would say, being open to ideas and thinking outside of the box.
I would say data. This will all fall apart if your data is not any good. And so you have to have, obviously, the data contracts, but the actual data hygiene. Can't review anything if the data is bad. You can't have any rules in if the data is not complete or the trade history is not right. The systems don't talk to each other. So I would say, it sounds very basic, but honestly, it's the basic tool that everything is built on, in my opinion.
And being a former compliance guy, I would just say that compliance isn't always the enemy. They have a job to do just like everybody else, right? They're not really the police. They're more advisors. I would see compliance as an advisor. So if there are some technologies or techniques that you do want to consider, all right, you hear the term shadow IT or shadow this because you don't want to go through the proper channels. If you bring your compliance folks and your legal folks into the process, you would educate them, help them understand what you need so that they're not going off, again, in like some vacuum, making the rules for you.
I always like to myth bust, compliance as the NO department. I call us the KNOW, thinking outside of the box. Help me understand what you're going through so we can help you get there.
Excellent. I don't see any audience questions in the app, if it's working or not. So we have a roving mic now. Does anybody have a question for our panel? There's one right over here.
Good to see you again, Michael. Great questions as always. So my question is just taking off from something that the panelists talked about earlier, which is data governance, explainability in this role. As we talk about AI compliance, everything nowadays. What role, from what I understood, there's, you're talking about, the regulators hopefully are listening and will take inputs from industry to set those guardrails in place. But do you think this is a regulator issue first? Are they going to sort of put the guardrails and, this is a little different from the usual rules-based commenting that we're talking about because the industry is innovating faster than And plus, even for the regulators themselves, it's a learning. So they're also trying to figure out, so what are you guardrailing when you don't even know what the track is? So that sort of situation. So, if you want to comment on how you think that's going to go. Basically, explainability, data governance, these broad.
I think someone's going to take a lead on that one.
Well, I'm happy to say we have to all be grown-ups, right? Like the banks, the firms, we all need to act like grown-ups because it's exciting and off you go. And every hour, someone's coming into my office from the business with a brand new great idea that they can use. And I think that we have to act like grown-ups because then when you dialogue with the regulators, you're right. You don't need the regulators to create your guardrails. You need to be the grown-up in the room from the beginning. So then when you are dialoguing, if you will, with the regulators, you have to show them that you acted like a grown-up. You have to show them what the setup has been and how you've created a path. I think that's, to me, invaluable and kind of transcends whatever the new technology is.
And that's why I think it's important for industry to lean in together with the regulators as we're all trying to figure this out. And I think that's where if you have a defendable approach, you've documented, we thought as adults, we thoroughly went through an analysis and here's how we got comfortable. Now, was it the wrong thing because now the regulators came up with a rule? Potentially, but that's where we come together and say, well, no, we thought this was okay and here's how we documented it, taking a risk-based approach.
And I see some firms that I work with taking the lead on this by creating committees, not just one type of person or one type of role. People coming together with different perspectives, putting out guidance, principles, because when you get down to the deeper part of regulation, it's pretty much all trying to do the same thing. So you're applying those principles, if you're using principles-based, to what should we be doing or should not be doing, or what will bite us in the end if we go in this direction. But that's not a one-person decision. That is a multi organization or multi-functional part of the organization decision.
Right, and then being agile, because then when the regulator comes out, nope, here's where we're drawing the line, then how do we adjust and adapt?
Yep, and I set up a process where any new piece that's being used needs a partner sponsor. So it's almost like, it's you, yes. So sometimes it's not a full committee because, the business thinks it's not being agile enough. But, but I think also having like multiple people responsible for it and asking the questions themselves before they come to compliance or legal is helpful.
Excellent. This has been very insightful. I've enjoyed your perspectives. I hope all of you have enjoyed them as well. I want to thank you, our panelists, and our audience. What we've heard today is that RegTech is essential to consistency, but regulations must evolve alongside innovation. Some harmonization is emerging here and there, but fragmentation remains. The future will depend on collaboration between regulators, institutions, and technology providers. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.